My step-parents called off my 20th birthday on the morning of my 20th birthday. Not the day before, when there might have been time to process it quietly and privately before the day itself arrived. Not a week before, when the information would have landed with pain but at least with some distance between the knowing and the living through it. On the morning of. At 8:14, while I was still in bed in the room I had lived in for 4 years since my father had married Sandra and we had all moved into the house that was supposed to become our family home, my stepmother knocked on my door and came in without waiting for an answer and told me that the birthday dinner planned for that evening had been cancelled. I asked why. She said that my stepbrother Connor had been upset since the previous evening. She said he had told her that having a celebration for me made him feel like he was not special enough in the family. She said she and my father had talked about it and decided that family harmony was more important than any single event and that we could do something for my birthday another time when the timing was better for everyone. She said all of this standing in the doorway of my room with her hands clasped in front of her in the particular posture of a woman who has made a decision she knows is wrong and has organized her body language around the hope that her posture will communicate reasonableness where the words cannot. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said I understood. She looked relieved. She said she knew I would understand because I was always the reasonable one. She closed the door. I lay in my bed for approximately 4 minutes. Then I got up and I started packing. My name is Natasha. I am 31 years old. What I am going to tell you now is the story of the morning I packed a bag on my 20th birthday and walked out of a house I had lived in for 4 years, and what I found when I left, and what the 11 years since that morning have looked like, and what happened when my step-parents finally understood what walking out had actually meant. But before the packing I need to tell you about the 4 years that made it necessary. The 4 years. My mother passed away when I was 15. I want to say that plainly because it is the foundation of everything that came after and because glossing over it in the interest of moving quickly to the more dramatic parts of the story would be dishonest about what those parts cost. She had been sick for 2 years before she died and I had spent those 2 years learning, in the way that children learn things they should not have to learn so young, how to manage my own fear and grief alongside the daily practical demands of a household where one parent was ill and the other was trying to hold everything together while also falling apart in the private way that people fall apart when they are watching someone they love disappear gradually. My father remarried when I was 16. Sandra had been in his life for less than a year before the wedding, which I had understood at the time as a speed born of loneliness rather than a lack of love for my mother, and I had made a decision, conscious and deliberate in the way that 16-year-olds can sometimes make decisions that surprise even themselves with their maturity, that I was going to give Sandra a genuine chance because my father needed something I could not give him and because my mother, who had been a generous person in every dimension of her life, would not have wanted me to close the door on something that made him less alone. Connor was Sandra's son. He was 14 when our parents married, 2 years younger than me, and he arrived in our newly combined household with the particular difficulty of a boy who had also lost something significant, his parents' marriage, and who expressed that difficulty in the way that certain adolescent boys express difficult things, through a combination of withdrawal and demand that left the adults around him perpetually off balance and perpetually adjusting. I tried with Connor. I want to be clear about that because I am not interested in a version of this story that erases the effort I made in the first 2 years of our shared household. I tried in the specific and consistent way that a girl who had just lost her mother and was trying to build something functional out of the wreckage of 2 families tries, which is patiently and without much acknowledgement and with the occasional private grief of someone who understands that the life she is building is a replacement for something that cannot be replaced. What I learned across those 2 years was that trying with Connor produced a specific and consistent result, which was that Connor received the trying as his due and Sandra received it as evidence that the household was functioning well and my father received it as relief, and that the trying cost me something nobody was tracking because nobody needed to track it when the result looked like harmony from the outside. The first time Sandra chose Connor's comfort over my needs in a way that was explicit rather than implicit I was 17. I had a school performance that I had been preparing for 3 months, a music recital that represented a significant personal achievement and that I had asked both parents to attend. Connor had a baseball game the same evening. Sandra took Connor to the game. My father attended my recital but left at the interval to pick up Sandra and Connor, which meant he was not there for the piece I played in the second half, the one I had practiced the longest and cared about the most. I did not say anything about it. I told myself it was a scheduling conflict and that scheduling conflicts were nobody's fault and that making it into something larger would only create tension in a household that was still finding its shape. This is the pattern I maintained for 4 years. Every time Sandra chose Connor. Every time the household reorganized around his comfort or his mood or his preference. Every time my father allowed the reorganization because Sandra wanted it and because my father, who had loved my mother completely and lost her and remarried too quickly and was still finding his way through the aftermath of all of it, did not have the resources to push back against a woman who knew what she wanted and was consistent about wanting it. I maintained the pattern because I was the reasonable one. Sandra had said so herself that morning in the doorway of my room. I was always the reasonable one. I was 20 years old on the morning she said it, and I had been the reasonable one for 4 years, and I had arrived, somewhere in the 4 minutes I lay in my bed after she closed the door, at the end of what reasonable had left to give. The packing. I packed 1 bag. Not because 1 bag was all I had or all I could have taken. I had 4 years of accumulated life in that room, books and clothes and the particular accumulation of objects that mark the space a person has inhabited for a significant period of their life. I packed 1 bag because 1 bag was what I needed for what came next and because taking more would have meant planning to come back for the rest, and I had decided, in the 4 minutes in my bed, that I was not coming back. I packed the things that were irreplaceable. My mother's photographs, which I kept in a box on the shelf above my desk and which had traveled with me from our old house to this one and which were going to travel with me again now. My laptop. My documents. 3 changes of clothes. The small journal I had been keeping since my mother got sick, 5 years of entries in my own handwriting that constituted the most honest record of my interior life that existed anywhere. I left everything else. I carried the bag downstairs at 9:40 in the morning. Sandra was in the kitchen. Connor was in the living room watching something on television with the particular ease of a boy who has just gotten what he wanted and is enjoying the getting of it without any awareness of what it cost. My father was not home. He had left for work before Sandra came to my room. I had considered waiting for him and had decided against it because waiting would have produced a conversation and the conversation would have produced Sandra managing my father and my father managing me, and the outcome would have been me agreeing to stay in the interest of family harmony, and I was finished with family harmony as a reason to make myself smaller. I put the bag by the front door. I went to the kitchen. Sandra looked at the bag and then at me with an expression that shifted from confusion to something I recognized as the beginning of alarm. I told her I was leaving. I told her I would be in touch with my father directly. I told her I hoped Connor felt special enough now. I picked up the bag. I opened the front door. I walked out into the morning of my 20th birthday and I did not look back at the house. I walked to Priya's house. Priya was my closest friend from school, the kind of friend who had known my mother and had sat with me through the 2 years of her illness and had been at the funeral and had watched the remarriage and the blended household with the particular attentiveness of someone who cares about you enough to see what you are not saying. She lived 20 minutes from Sandra's house on foot, and I walked those 20 minutes on the morning of my 20th birthday with 1 bag and the particular lightness that arrives when you have made a decision that is frightening and correct at the same time. She opened the door before I knocked. She had a way of knowing when I was coming that I had stopped trying to explain. She looked at the bag. She looked at my face. She stepped aside to let me in. She did not ask what had happened. She made tea and put it on the table and sat across from me and waited, because Priya understood that some things need to be said in their own time rather than extracted by questions. I told her everything. The birthday dinner. Connor. The doorway. The 4 minutes in my bed. The packing. The walk. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Happy birthday." I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed on my 20th birthday, and it was 9:50 in the morning, and it came from somewhere genuine, the specific laughter of a person who has just done something irreversible and is beginning to understand that irreversible was exactly what was needed. I stayed with Priya for 3 weeks. Her parents, who had known me since I was 12 and who had been quietly furious on my behalf about various Sandra-related events over the previous 4 years, received me without ceremony and without excessive questions and with the practical generosity of people who understand that what a person in a difficult situation needs most is not to be made to feel like a burden while they figure out what comes next. My father called that evening. I answered because he was my father and because whatever had happened with Sandra and Connor had not changed that. He asked where I was. I told him I was at Priya's. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was better than I had been in 4 years, which was true and which I said not to wound him but because he deserved the honest version rather than the managed one. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was sorry. Not for any specific thing, not for the birthday dinner or for leaving before the second half of the recital or for any of the individual instances across 4 years. Just sorry, the large general sorry of a man who has understood something about the accumulated weight of small choices and does not yet have the language to address it specifically. I told him I knew. I told him I loved him. I told him I needed some time and that I would be in touch. Sandra called the following morning. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that described my leaving as an overreaction to a minor scheduling change and expressed hope that I would come home soon so we could talk about it as a family. I listened to the message once and did not listen to it again. Connor did not call. This did not surprise me. The 11 years. I am going to tell you about the 11 years honestly because I think the honest version is more useful than the version where leaving produces immediate and satisfying results, because it did not produce immediate and satisfying results. It produced 3 weeks on Priya's couch followed by a small room in a shared house followed by 2 jobs and a community college enrollment followed by a transfer to a 4-year university followed by a degree in social work followed by a career that has been built slowly and carefully and with the particular intentionality of someone who has understood since the age of 20 that nobody is going to build it for her. The first year was the hardest. Not because I regretted leaving, I never regretted leaving, but because leaving at 20 with one bag and no plan is genuinely difficult in the practical sense and the practical difficulty does not care about the emotional rightness of the decision that produced it. I worked 2 jobs for 14 months. I ate a lot of rice and eggs. I studied on my breaks and on the bus and in the early morning hours before the first shift began. I called my father every Sunday and we talked about ordinary things and neither of us talked about Sandra or Connor because those conversations produced outcomes neither of us knew how to handle yet. My father came to my college graduation. Alone. He did not explain why Sandra had not come and I did not ask. We had lunch afterward at a restaurant near the campus and he told me he was proud of me in a way that was different from the pride he had expressed at various points across my childhood, more specific and more weighted, the pride of a man who understands that what he is proud of was built without his help and is more remarkable for that. I told him I was glad he was there. I meant it completely. The career I built is in social work, specifically in family services, which is a choice that people sometimes find surprising given my history and that I find entirely logical given my history, because the families I work with are navigating versions of what I navigated and the thing I can offer them that training alone does not produce is the specific understanding of what it costs to be the reasonable one in a household that requires unreasonable things of you. I am good at my job. I have been told this by colleagues and by supervisors and occasionally by the families I work with in the particular wordless way that people communicate the things they cannot say. I built it from nothing, from a bag and a walk and a cup of tea at Priya's kitchen table on the morning of my 20th birthday, and it is mine in the specific way that things are mine when no one helped build them and no one can take them. The call. Sandra called me on a Tuesday evening 11 years after the morning I walked out. I knew before I answered that this was not an ordinary call. Sandra had called me periodically across the 11 years, birthday calls and holiday calls and the occasional call that was framed as checking in but had the quality of monitoring rather than genuine interest. I had managed those calls with the polite distance of someone who has made peace with a relationship without pretending it is something it is not. This call was different from the moment she said hello. The texture of it was different. Something underneath the usual careful composure had shifted and what was present instead was something I recognized from my professional life, the particular quality of a person who is calling because they need something real and have run out of alternatives. She told me my father had been diagnosed with a serious illness. She said it directly, which I gave her credit for, without the cushioning language that people sometimes use when they are delivering difficult news and are more focused on managing the delivery than on the person receiving it. She said the prognosis was uncertain and that the treatment was going to be demanding and that she was finding it difficult to manage alone. I sat with the phone for a moment. I asked how my father was. She told me. I asked about the treatment plan. She told me. I asked what kind of support would be most useful. She told me that too, and as she was telling me I was already thinking about what I could offer and how to structure it and what the practical shape of being present for my father was going to look like from a city 2 hours away. Then she said something I had not expected. She said she was sorry. Not sorry about the illness, not sorry about the practical situation she was calling to ask for help with. Sorry about the birthday dinner. Sorry about the 11 years of calls that had been monitoring rather than genuine interest. Sorry about the doorway and the clasped hands and the word reasonable used as a reason to take from me rather than a quality to be valued. She said Connor had moved out of the house 3 years earlier under circumstances she did not elaborate on and that the house had been quieter since and that the quiet had given her time to think about things she had preferred not to think about when the house was full. I listened to all of it. Then I told her I would come the following weekend to see my father. Not for her. Not to signal forgiveness or to collapse 11 years of careful distance into a single phone call. For my father, who was sick and who needed his daughter and who had been at my college graduation alone and who had said he was proud of me in the specific way that meant he understood what the building had cost. I drove the 2 hours on a Saturday morning. My father was thinner than I had expected and the illness had aged him in the ways that serious illness ages people, but his eyes were the same and when I walked into the room he looked at me the way he had looked at me at the graduation lunch, with the specific weight of a man who knows what he is seeing and is grateful for it. I stayed for the weekend. I cooked the meals. I sat with him in the evenings and we watched the programs he liked and talked about ordinary things and I held his hand when he fell asleep in the chair and I looked at the room, the house that had been Sandra's house and Connor's house and never quite my house, and I felt something I had not expected to feel in it. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not because the house had changed. Because I had. I go back every other weekend now. My father is responding to the treatment in ways his doctors find encouraging. Sandra makes tea when I arrive and we talk about practical things and occasionally about harder things and we are building, slowly and without pretending it is more than it is, something that might eventually be called understanding. Connor called me once, 4 months after Sandra's call. He said he had heard I was coming back to help with Dad. He said it was good of me. I thanked him. I did not tell him what I was thinking, which was that goodness had nothing to do with it. That I was there because my father was my father and because the 20-year-old who had walked out with one bag on her birthday had grown into someone who understood the difference between leaving what needed to be left and abandoning what needed to be held. I had left the house. I had never left my father. The difference between those two things is the whole story. If you were ever the reasonable one in a family that used your reasonableness against you, leave a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. Subscribe for the next one. This is Hidden Truth Revenge, where the truth always finds a way.